Child abuse and neglect is one of the nation's most serious concerns. According to the Children's Bureau, there are approximately 3 million reports nationally each year of abuse and neglect. South Dakota accounts for approximately 15,000 of these reports. Child abuse and neglect reports can come from a variety of reporters. Though any citizen may make a report, South Dakota state law requires the following individuals to report suspected child abuse and neglect as defined in South Dakota Codified Law 26-8A-3. These individuals are also referred to as mandatory reporters. Mandatory reporters are the eyes and ears of Child Protection Services and law enforcement. These individuals have extensive contact with children on a daily basis. Oftentimes, mandatory reporters are the first individuals a child will disclose abuse or neglect to because of their close relationship and contact with the child. In turn, mandatory reporters are often the first individuals to suspect or recognize child abuse or neglect because they recognize the behavioral changes in a child. Failure by a mandatory reporter to report child abuse or neglect is a misdemeanor. The Division of Child Protection Services and law enforcement agencies are required by law to investigate reports of child abuse or neglect. Any person who knows or has reasonable cause to suspect a child has been physically or emotionally injured, neglected, or sexually abused should report it immediately. Even though this training is designed for mandatory reporters in the state of South Dakota, any and all citizens who are concerned about a child's safety and welfare are encouraged to report abuse and or neglect. This training is designed to assist mandatory reporters in their role of reporting child abuse and neglect. By completing the course, you will increase knowledge of the state of South Dakota's child abuse and neglect laws, increase knowledge of types and indicators of abuse and neglect, and increase knowledge of the role and process of reporting abuse and or neglect. This training consists of 6 modules and is designed to be flexible, so the amount of time it takes you to complete it may vary. Once you begin the training, you will need to complete the training in full and will not be able to stop and resume where you left off. At the end of the training, you will receive a certificate of completion. Let's get started. To begin, let's discuss South Dakota codified laws, specifically chapters 26-8A and 26-7A. These sections define and provide guidance for responding to child abuse and neglect. The entire chapters may be found in South Dakota Codified Law, Volume 17. Because of the variations among tribes, tribal codes are not listed. For the purpose of this mandatory reporting training, the following sections are noted. 26-8A-2, Abused or Neglected Child Defined. In this chapter and chapter 26-7A, the term abused and neglected child means a child whose parent, guardian, or custodian has abandoned the child or has subjected the child to mistreatment or abuse, who lacks proper parental care through the actions or omissions of the parent, guardian, or custodian, whose environment is injurious to the child's welfare, whose parent, guardian, or custodian fails or refuses to provide proper or necessary subsistence, supervision, education, medical care, or any other care necessary for the child's health, guidance, or well-being, who is homeless without proper care or not domiciled with the child's parent, guardian, or custodian through no fault of the child's parent, guardian, or custodian, who is threatened with substantial harm, who has sustained emotional harm or mental injury as indicated by an injury to the child's intellectual or psychological capacity, evidenced by an observable and substantial impairment in the child's ability to function with the child's normal range of performance and behavior with due regard to the child's culture, who is subject to sexual abuse, sexual molestation, or sexual exploitation by the child's parent, guardian, custodian, or any other person responsible for the child's care, who was subject to prenatal exposure to abusive use of alcohol, marijuana, or any controlled drug or substance not lawfully prescribed by a practitioner as authorized by chapters 22 through 42 and 3420b, whose parent, guardian, or custodian knowingly exposes the child to an environment that is being used for the manufacture, use, or distribution of methamphetamine or any other unlawfully manufactured controlled drug or substance. 26-8A-3. Persons required to report child abuse or neglected child, intentional failure as misdemeanor. Any of the people identified earlier, such as a physician, dentist, teacher, school official, and others who have reasonable cause to suspect that a child under the age of 18 has been abused or neglected as defined in 26-8A-2, shall report that information in accordance with 26-8A-6, 26-8A-7, and 26-8A-8. Any person who intentionally fails to make the required report is guilty of a Class 1 misdemeanor. Any person who knows or has reason to suspect that a child has been abused or neglected as defined in 26-8A-2 may report that information as provided in 26-8A-8. 26-8A-4. Additional persons to report death resulting from abuse or neglect. Intentional failure as misdemeanor. In addition to the report required under 26-8A-3, any person who has reasonable cause to suspect that a child has died as a result of child abuse or neglect, as defined in 26-8A-2, shall report that information to the medical examiner or coroner. Upon receipt of the report, the medical examiner or coroner shall cause an investigation to be made and submit written findings to the state's attorney and the Department of Social Services. Any person required to report under this section who knowingly and intentionally fails to make a report is guilty of a Class 1 misdemeanor. 26-8A-5. Application of terms. As used in 26-8A-3 and 26-8A-7, the terms teacher, school counselor, school official, school administrator, school principal, and school superintendent apply to any person substantially performing the respective duties of such position in any public or private school, whether accredited or unaccredited, and to any person providing instruction pursuant to 13-27-3. 26-8A-6. Report of abuse or neglect by hospital personnel. Failure as misdemeanor. Written policy required. Any person who has contact with a child through the performance of services as a member of a staff of a hospital or similar institution shall immediately notify the person in charge of the institution or his designee of suspected abuse or neglect. The person in charge shall report the information in accordance with the provisions of 26-8A-8. Any person required by this section to report shall also promptly submit to the state's attorney complete copies of all medical examination, treatment, and hospital records regarding the child. Any person who knowingly and intentionally fails to make a required report and to submit copies of records is guilty of a Class 1 misdemeanor. Each hospital or similar institution shall have a written policy on reporting of child abuse and neglect and submission of medical examination, treatment, and hospital records to the state's attorney. 26-8A-7. Child abuse or neglect reports by school personnel. Failure as misdemeanor. Written policy required. Any person who has contact with a child through the performance of services in any public or private school, whether accredited or unaccredited, as a teacher, school nurse, school counselor, school official, or administrator, or any person providing services pursuant to 13-27-3, shall notify the school principal or superintendent and report the information in accordance with the provisions of 26-8A-8. Any person who knowingly and intentionally fails to make a report required is guilty of a Class 1 misdemeanor. Each school district shall have a written policy on reporting of child abuse and neglect. 26-8A-8. Oral report of child abuse. To whom made, responses report. The reports required by 26-8A-3, 26-8A-6, and 26-8A-7 and by other sections of this chapter shall be made orally and immediately by telephone or otherwise to the state's attorney of the county in which the child resides or is present, to the Department of Social Services, or to the law enforcement officers. The mandatory reporter who witnessed the disclosure or evidence of the abuse or neglect must be available to answer questions when the initial report is made pursuant to this section. The state's attorney or the law enforcement officers, upon receiving a report, shall immediately notify the Department of Social Services. Any person receiving a report of suspected child abuse or child neglect shall keep the report confidential as provided in 26-8A-13, except as otherwise provided in Chapter 26-7A, or this chapter. The person receiving a report alleging child abuse or neglect shall ask whether or not the reporting party desires a response report. If requested by the reporting person, the Department of Social Services or the concerned law enforcement officer shall issue within 30 days a written acknowledgment of receipt of the report and a response stating whether or not the report will be investigated. 26-8A-9. Investigation of oral report, other action permitted, appointment of attorney, compensation. Upon receipt of a report pursuant to 26-8A-8, the Department of Social Services or law enforcement officers shall investigate. Investigating personnel may personally interview a child out of the presence of the child's parents, guardian, or custodian without advance notice or consent. The investigation does not prohibit any other lawful action. If the investigation and report indicate that child abuse or neglect has occurred, the state's attorney shall take appropriate action immediately. 26-8A-10. Reports to Social Services. Content. A report made pursuant to 26-8A-8 to the Department of Social Services shall include the date and place of birth of the child, the name and address of the child's parents, guardian, custodian, or responsible persons, and the date of the report, the suspected or proven instances of child abuse or neglect as defined in 26-8A-2. The Department of Social Services shall be the central registry for such information. 26-8A-13. Confidentiality of abuse or neglect information. Violation as misdemeanor release to certain parties. All investigative case records and files relating to reports of child abuse and neglect are confidential, and no disclosure of such records, files, or other information may be made except as authorized in Chapter 26-7A, or this chapter. Any person who knowingly violates the confidential nature of the records, files, or information is guilty of a Class 1 misdemeanor. The Department of Social Services may release records, files, or other information to the following parties upon the receipt by the Department of a request showing that it is necessary for the parties to have such information in the performance of official functions relating to child abuse or neglect. 26-8A-14. Immunity from liability. Any person or party participating in good faith in the making of a report or the submitting of copies of medical examination, treatment, or hospitalization records pursuant to 26-8A-3 to 26-8A-8 or pursuant to any other provisions of this chapter is immune from any liability, civil or criminal, that might otherwise be incurred or imposed, and has the same immunity for participation in any judicial proceedings resulting from the report. Immunity also extends in the same manner to persons requesting the taking of photographs and x-rays pursuant to 26-8A-16, to persons taking the photographs and x-rays to child protection teams established by the Secretary of Social Services, to public officials or employees involved in the investigation and treatment of child abuse and neglect, or making a temporary placement of the child pursuant to this chapter, or to any person who in good faith cooperates with a child protection team or the Department of Social Services in investigation, placement, or a treatment plan. The provisions of this section or any other section granting or allowing the grant of immunity do not extend to any person alleged to have committed an act or acts of child abuse. 26-8A-16. Photographs, videotapes, or other images, and medical examinations without consent, disposition. Any person receiving a report under 26-8A-3 may take or cause to be taken color photographs, videotapes, or other images of the areas of trauma visible on a child who is the subject of the report and may require a radiological or other medical examination or testing of the child without the consent of the child's parents, guardian, or custodian. All photographs, videotapes, or other images taken pursuant to this section shall be taken by a law enforcement official, the Department of Social Services, or a person authorized by a law enforcement official or the department. All photographs, videotapes, other images, X-rays, and test results or copies of them shall be sent to the appropriate law enforcement agency, state's attorney, or to the Department of Social Services. These photographs, videotapes, and other images may not be made a part of the child's medical or hospital records. Any photograph, videotapes, or other image in the possession of the Department of Social Services shall be destroyed by the Department of Social Services if no criminal prosecution or civil action is initiated within 3 years of the date that such material was received by the Department of Social Services. As a mandatory reporter, what does the law require you to do? South Dakota codified law requires when a mandatory reporter suspects a child has been abused or neglected, or is at danger of being abused or neglected, they are to immediately report the abuse and/or neglect. The report is to be made orally, by phone, or in person to Child Protection Services, local law enforcement, or the state's attorney. You do not need evidence an incident of child abuse or neglect occurred with a child. You only need a reasonable suspicion. It is the responsibility of Child Protection Services and law enforcement teams to determine if the maltreatment occurred and what steps will need to be taken to ensure the child's safety. In order to meet your responsibility of reporting abuse or neglect, you may be asking, what does child abuse and neglect look like? We'll discuss the definitions of the 4 categories of abuse and neglect, including a brief summary of indicators. Please keep in mind, none of the indicators alone are definitive of child abuse. It is necessary to look at the family's total functioning to determine if safety concerns exist. It is important to note, for purposes of this training, the terminology parent, guardian, or custodian is used in defining the 4 categories. Mandatory reporters are required to report any child abuse or neglect, no matter what relationship the person has with the child. For example, say a school teacher suspects a community soccer coach is using physical punishment with the child participants. The coach is not a parent, guardian, or custodian to the child. However, the mandatory reporter is required to report. Physical abuse refers to an action of the parent, guardian, or custodian that is non-accidental and results in physical injuries, often occurring in the name of discipline or punishment. Physical abuse may be identified by the following indicators. Examples of physical abuse could include, but are not limited to, physical neglect occurs when a parent, guardian, or custodian fails to provide for a child's basic needs like food, clothing, shelter, education, medical care, or supervision and abandonment. The failure to meet basic needs must represent a threat to the child's immediate health and safety or an impending danger if there is a pattern or history of the child's needs not being met. Here are some of the indicators of physical neglect. The child is malnourished, emaciated, is always hungry or begging for food, or is seldom fed nutritious food. A medical diagnosis is usually necessary to determine malnutrition. The child's clothing is inappropriate or insufficient to protect the child from the weather, or clothing is so dirty or smelly that it constitutes a health hazard. The caretakers fail to provide a home, or the home is in a condition that presents a health hazard or dangers such as fire. The caretakers fail to provide supervision of a child. The child's age and competence, amount of time left unsupervised, time of day the child is unsupervised, and degree of parental planning for the unsupervised period must be considered. Community standards need to be considered when making judgments concerning lack of supervision. The caretaker's substance use or concerns related to their mental health render them incapable of routinely and consistently attending to the child's basic needs. Family violence involving physical and/or verbal altercations is occurring in the presence of a child. Emotional maltreatment occurs when a parent, guardian, or custodian fails to provide the emotional nurturing needed for a child's psychological growth and development, or willfully denies the child the emotional stability necessary for proper psychological growth and development. Emotional maltreatment results in an observable or measurable impairment of the child. Indicators of emotional maltreatment are as follows. Physical indicators. Failure to thrive is diagnosed. The child does not gain weight or meet developmental norms, despite adequate feedings and absence of physiological causes. Failure to thrive is caused by failure to emotionally nurture, cuddle, and hold the child, such as leaving the child in a crib all day. The caretaker verbally abuses the child, such as constant harassment, belittling, humiliation, repeated threats, or constant criticism. The child is ignored or isolated by parents physically and emotionally for long periods of time. An example includes a child who is sent to an empty room for hours or days to be isolated from the rest of the family. Examples of emotional maltreatment could include, but are not limited to, the following. Sexual abuse and exploitation occurs when a parent, guardian, or custodian commits or allows contacts or interactions between a child and adult, where the child is used for the sexual stimulation of the parent, guardian, caretaker, or other responsible person. Sexual abuse may also be committed by a person under the age of 18 when that person is significantly older than the victim or in a position of power and control over the child. Indicators include physical indicators, difficulty walking or sitting, pain or itching in genital area, bruises or bleeding in external genitalia, vaginal or anal areas, venereal disease, especially in preteens, pregnancy. Behavioral indicators, unwilling to change for gym or participate in physical education class, withdrawal, fantasy or bizarre, sophisticated, or unusual sexual behavior or knowledge, poor peer relationships, delinquent or runaway behavior, reports sexual assault by caretaker. There's also the issue of human trafficking. There are two types of human trafficking. Sex trafficking is when a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age. Labor trafficking, the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. The presence of the following indicators does not definitively mean the child is a trafficking victim. These indicators serve as clues to be assessed within the broader context of all information presented. Look for the possible sex trafficking indicators and red flags noted here. Examples of sexual abuse could include, but are not limited to, the following. Nationwide, physical neglect is the leading type of maltreatment among children. Here's a look at maltreatment types in South Dakota. It is important to note these figures represent only reports to Child Protection Services where an allegation of abuse by a parent, caretaker, or guardian was substantiated. These numbers do not reflect cases of abuse by a non-parent, caretaker, or guardian, such as a neighbor, relative, or another child, situations where there was not enough evidence to substantiate, or cases that were not reported. The graph also does not represent those cases investigated by law enforcement agencies and/or tribal partners. Considering the four categories, match the following scenarios to the correct abuse/neglect category. You observe a 3-year-old child unsupervised on the playground. There are no adults within sight of the child. An 8-year-old boy tells you he has a secret. He reported his uncle touches his genitals. The uncle instructs the child to do the same to him. He tells the child it is their secret and he is not to tell anyone. A 6-year-old child reported her mother slapped her across the face because she was back-talking. The child has a distinct mark across her left cheek that appears to be a handprint. During a visit to a family's home, you see rotting food on the countertops, animal feces on the floor, and exposed wiring throughout the residence. The home is also infested with mice. There are twin 2-year-olds in the home. A 16-year-old was excelling in school, and within the last 2 months, his grades have slipped tremendously. He reported his father tells him he is worthless and would be better off dead. The child reported this has been going on for years, but has increased to daily since his parents separated 2 months ago. The child feels hopeless, helpless, and has suicidal ideations. When he expressed these feelings to his father, he was told, "Good, you'll do us all a favor." It is not uncommon for a mandatory reporter who is working with children to be the first person to whom a child discloses abuse allegations. Properly handling this situation helps the child as well as the mandatory reporter. It is natural to ask the child questions relating to the situation. However, please keep in mind you are not interviewing the child. If a child makes a statement, simply listen to everything they have to say. Do not question the child about specific details or timing of events. The sooner a report is made, the sooner Child Protection Services or law enforcement can meet with the child and ask the appropriate questions. The following suggestions are important for mandatory reporters to be aware of when a child discloses abuse. Do practice your response before the situation arises. As a professional, understand your school, agency, clinic, or daycare's policy for reporting allegation of abuse. Remain calm. Let your body language tell the child you hear what he or she is telling you and you believe them. Try to talk with the child in a private place where others cannot overhear and you won't be interrupted. Make the child as comfortable as possible. Listen to the child. Use your best listening skills and let the child talk. Give the child your full attention. Write down the exact words the child used in the disclosure and during your interactions. The words the child uses are significant, therefore accuracy is very important. Thank the child for having the courage to report this to you. The child needs to know disclosing to you is the right thing to do. Some examples of what to say are, "Thank you. I believe you. We will get you some help to deal with this." Or, "I am here just to listen if you need to talk." Inform the child as soon as possible of what will happen next regarding the report. Report the disclosure of abuse. South Dakota has a centralized intake where all calls of suspected child abuse and neglect can be made. This number is 1-877-244-0864. Do not use shocked or disbelieving body language when a child discloses to you. If you are skeptical, try not to express your doubts to the child. Don't try to talk the child out of what he or she is telling you. Do not hover over the child when he or she is disclosing. This is a position of power and may intimidate the child. Don't suggest or guess the child might have been abused. This can impair the investigation and prosecution process. Do not make a conclusion about the validity of the allegation. This is the responsibility of the investigators, judge, and jury. When a child chooses you to make their disclosure, avoid letting the "I'm special" feeling get in the way of responding in the best interest of the child. Do not discuss the allegations with anyone, including non-essential coworkers and relatives. This betrays the child and breaks confidentiality. Avoid discussing the disclosure of the allegations with the child's peers around. The child deserves privacy. Do not make promises to the child. Reassure the child that you will do what is necessary to keep them safe. Most important, do not ask the child any additional questions. Children need to be fully interviewed by trained interviewers through Child Protection Services, law enforcement, or child advocacy centers to ensure the best outcome for the child. Children should only be asked questions about their disclosure one time. The more people who ask questions, the more the child may be traumatized and the more tainted their statement may become. If the case goes to court, each person who questions the child ultimately risks damaging the child's statement. Disclosure may be difficult for children as there may be a sense of shame associated with the maltreatment. They feel loyalty to the abuser, fear of not being believed. The abuser told the child to keep a secret and threatened them, and the fear of what will happen next. Continue to support the child. Even though you will be reporting to Child Protection Services or law enforcement, the child may continue to look to you for support since you are aware of the situation and the child sees you as a safe person. To report child abuse or neglect, please call 1-877-244-0864. Intake specialists will be available from 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. If reporting an emergency situation, reporting before 8 or after 5, on the weekends, or during a holiday, contact your local law enforcement. Please note, if a situation is emergent, call 911 and report it immediately. Examples of this could be an intoxicated individual driving with children in the car, or perhaps a violent situation actively occurring and children are present. Intake specialists with the Division of Child Protective Services receive the information through the automated call center. The intake process is the first and one of the most important stages of ensuring child safety. With sufficient and adequate information, the agency is better able to make well-informed decisions on the need for intervention with a family. The more information you can provide the intake specialist, the better. Information gathered by the intake specialist includes demographic information about the household, including names and dates of birth of the children, parents, other household members, and/or non-resident parent. Permanent address of child and the present location of the child. Name and address of person alleged to be responsible for abuse or neglect. Nature and extent of suspected abuse or neglect. They'll ask for a brief description of the abuse or neglect concerns, circumstances supporting the maltreatment, descriptions of events leading up to the incident, date or time the incident occurred, location of where the incident occurred, any witnesses or others who have knowledge, any history of prior involvements or incidents. Overall functioning of the child. How the child or children function on a daily basis, involvement in activities, enrollment in school or daycare, medical concerns, mental health concerns, any traumatic events, relationships with others, behavioral concerns, and so on. General parenting knowledge, parent or caregiver's strengths, areas of need, ability to care for the child, attitudes or perceptions of the child. Discipline. Are any discipline techniques or practices utilized in the home? Overall functioning of the parent or caregiver. Are they employed? Violent. Involved with drugs or alcohol. Domestic violence concerns. Support system traumatic events. Medical concerns. Mental health concerns. Relationships with others, or involved with law enforcement. Safety for staff responding. Does the household have aggressive animals, weapons, or drug-related traffic? Family information. Potential family or friends that could keep the child safe should they need to be removed from the household for their safety. Tribal affiliations. Household or household members affiliated with a tribe. Reporter's name, telephone number, and mailing address. Reporter's motivation for making the referral. Reason the reporter called. What are the reporter's expectations? Here are some helpful hints. Call as soon as the incident is discovered. Give accurate and descriptive information of the incident, what the child reported, and/or a description of the physical evidence. Don't investigate the report yourself. When in doubt, report. It's Child Protection Services and/or law enforcement's job to determine the validity of the report. After making a report, you may be wondering what will happen next. When a report of abuse and neglect is made to the Division of Child Protection Services, the division makes several critical decisions regarding the report. These include the decision on how to address the report, the best way to proceed, and, if assigned, the immediacy of the response time. Several options may occur with a report. A report may be screened out. This does not mean that the report was not accurate or not good enough. A screened out report means at this time, considering all the information gathered, the information does not meet the criteria for assignment. Even if the report is screened out, your concerns are maintained in the child welfare computer system for a period of time. These reports and information contained in the report may be considered should additional reports be received on the family. A report may be referred to law enforcement for their review so they can proceed with further investigation as deemed appropriate. These situations are those in which the alleged perpetrator is not a parent, guardian, or custodian. The allegations are solely criminal in nature. The child was temporarily staying with a caregiver, and there is no plan for the child to return, or past allegations in which the perpetrator is no longer in the family household. Other examples of cases in which law enforcement may investigate separately include non-family members who are not providing substitute care or teachers in non-residential type settings. A report may be referred to another agency, such as a tribal child protection program. These situations include those families in which Child Protection Services received a report regarding children who reside on the reservation and Child Protection Services are provided by the tribe. A report may be assigned for further assessment by the Division of Child Protection Services. The Family Services Specialist completes an initial family assessment, which is a neutral approach to gathering information about the report through such means as interviews, observations, and reviewing documents. The assessment may be completed by Child Protection Services or in conjunction with law enforcement, who may also refer a child to a child advocacy center for further evaluation. The first contact Child Protection Services and/or law enforcement have with the child may be at the school, daycare, or at the child's home. In addition to reviewing the child victim, the Family Services Specialist and/or law enforcement will interview the siblings, parents, alleged perpetrator, and other individuals who may have knowledge or information about the family and their situation. In completing the assessment, it may be necessary to observe the family's home and review pertinent records, such as school or medical records. The first and most important concern is the safety of the child. If it is determined the child is unsafe, a Family Services Specialist will work jointly with the parents on a plan to improve the situation. Normally, a child would not be removed from the home and, if possible, remain in the home with a protective, non-offending caregiver while services are arranged. However, if a child must be removed for his or her own safety, a judge may order removal of the child from the situation, or a law enforcement officer may take protective custody. Child Protection Services does not have the authority to remove children. Only the court and law enforcement are able to do so. Child Protection Services works diligently to locate relatives. When this is not possible, placement in a foster home or in group care may be necessary. If a child is removed from the home, Child Protection Services' ultimate goal is to reunite the child with their parents or caregivers. Services are available to families in which children are determined to be unsafe because of abuse or neglect. Support services include, but are not limited to, training for families in parenting skills, home management, referrals for mental health counseling, referrals for substance abuse treatment, family functioning assessments, domestic violence services, or other assistance. As a mandatory reporter, you have the right to know what happened with the report within the bounds of confidentiality. South Dakota Codified Law 26-8A-8 states, if requested by the reporting person, the Department of Social Services or concerned law enforcement office shall issue within 30 days a written acknowledgement of the receipt of the report and a response stating whether or not the report will be investigated. It is also important to know your information as a mandated reporter is kept confidential. The Department of Social Services does not release the reporting person's name or identifying information. However, a court may order the release of the information if necessary for a determination by the court. Thank you for your attention. Child abuse and neglect is a serious concern, so do your part. Report anything you suspect might be considered abuse or neglect. It's the law.